regions are observable patterns in space. They have ecological or environmental components. They have social components. They have interesting combinations of both. Economies, markets, built environments build on and incorporate both kinds of characteristics to create regions of great complexity and interest. These are empirically real in the sense that they are out there in the world. However, observing them is not a passive matter of simply, hey, there it is on the ground. Observing them is an act. The patterns we see are in part a function of what we look for, what kinds of questions we ask, how we define what counts as similar or dissimilar between two different places. The act of recognizing regions or regionalizing a given landscape can in turn affect the empirical reality we are observing. Territorialization being a nice example of this, right? The lines that get drawn on a map and then become the blueprint for various kinds of activities, whether you're partitioning Africa or partitioning the West Bank, these regionalizations have the power to come out of people's heads and onto the landscape and affect people in the present and for a long time into the future. We cannot not do this. We cannot fail to recognize patterns. It's part of the way we perceive things. But we also have to recognize that our act of perceiving them and seeing these patterns is a part of the process of their production. Scale. This depiction perhaps is too simple. It suggests that they're all nicely nested within each other, from the individual person or household outwards to neighborhoods and cities and states and nations and continents, right? But that gives you a sense, at least, of the diversity of scales on which you can start to see patterns. We can put measurements on them if that helps us to make sense of them better, right? Quantify their area. These patterns are produced over time at all of these scales. In other words, whatever we observe, whatever patterns we perceive, have a history of processes that interacted over time and space to produce those patterns. In many ways, the framework of this class is to think about all those processes, beginning with the very biggest scales, temporally speaking and spatially speaking, to think about the movement of the continents, and then to narrow it down and look at smaller and smaller spatial and temporal scales all the way down to the individual at a checkpoint, or the individual being asked for an identity card in the streets of Phoenix. And to think about all those different processes that create the conditions that we see at any given point in space-time. Like patterns, processes are both empirically real and simultaneously acts of our conceptualization. Both are abstracted from empirical reality and to some degree simplifications. Right? To identify a process is to single it out and give it a meaning that is a way of making sense of what we see and identifying patterns. And those are tools for thought. We can't actually think about regions without, on some level, thinking about these processes. And to that extent, it's our responsibility to be self-conscious of that act of conceptualizing them. To understand the processes at all these different scales, because all those different processes and scales are real and they matter, but also to understand that they represent our attempt to make sense of this, and they always have the potential to be simplistic or even misleading. The idea that you can build a wall and keep Mexicans out of this country is a simplistic, misleading idea that only makes sense if you don't live near the border. So we put this all together on a two-dimensional depiction of space-time, from bodies up to the globe, from events taking place in a split-second fashion, or in a matter of days like Tiananmen Square, all the way out to millennia and epochs. And we can see that the authors we have read and the movies we have seen can be arrayed in this figure. Orwell thinking about a momentary encounter with an elephant and a group of Bernese peasants, right? Movies about particular cities and their histories over a period of several years to decades. Kapuscinski talking about the events in an entire nation as Zaire was born. You get out to Crosby here, and you're talking about processes that took thousands of years to unfold on a stage that was global in scale. Davis is thinking about the events of a matter of decades, again, at a global scale. These are all, you can organize the way you think about the interactions of these readings and their ideas in terms of the different scales at which they are observing patterns and processes. We can then look at these processes and arrange them. Continental drift belongs somewhere over here, right? Evolution, over here. You can put the different things we have thought about on this graph. The question of how these processes interact over scales is extremely complicated, and is in fact where most, well not most maybe, but a whole lot of the most interesting research in both the natural sciences and the social sciences is trying to make sense of precisely this. How do you relate Hurricane Katrina to climate change? In some ways it's clear that it must be related. In other ways its relations are extremely complex and difficult to pin down. We can perhaps best think about drawing circles here to indicate the overall spatial temporal scale of different processes that we've looked at. Climate change might be depicted something like this. Right? It actually does operate at very small spatial scales, but also at global ones. It's very large spatially. It's also very prolonged temporally. Very likely the effects of climate change now will be felt for even more than 1,000 years. Evolution might take up this entire figure. Globalization is a process that's happened thus far over a period of several decades, but which obviously reaches all the way from individual bodies up to the globe as a whole. Urbanization, according to Davis, the process of global urbanization is located spatially around the world and temporally in the period since roughly 1950, and this is precisely what makes it new, right? That's what differentiates urbanization now from what we previously thought urbanization meant. Devaluation of currencies, for instance, depicted in some of the movies, is perhaps spatially, temporally depicted in this way. Capitalism. It's a mode of production. It involves social and ecological relations, institutions and ideas that orient and constrain action, including production, distribution, and consumption. The central process that it embodies, according to Marx, is this process, this transformation of money into commodities and then back into a larger amount of money. It produces spatial and social patterns at multiple scales. We have seen that this process has been extraordinarily important and powerful in shaping the regions, the patterns that we see in the world in the last 200 years or so, and especially in the last 50 years or so. Industrial capitalism has expanded to a global scale. It is constantly interacting with the physical environment. We could argue that fossil fuels have subsidized its growth from the very beginning and may threaten its future through climate change. It is embodied by people through labor and their activities. Capitalism needs the actions of people in order to exist and persist, right? It is constantly reproducing itself, and it is very tightly coupled with the things that millions and millions, billions of people do every day. The process intrinsically elevates profits and exchange values over use values and people, as well as over nature. That is its inherent telos. Globalized capitalism in the last 30 to 40 years has accelerated the turnover time of capital, and it has expanded the scale on which capital circulates and is accumulated. You see an ever finer grained control of production, efforts to produce just in time, to reduce inventories to the bare minimum, to operate simultaneously over ever larger extents of space. In the face of this, the regions that we are perhaps most comfortable with, such as continents or nation states, appear increasingly non-contiguous, fragmented, superimposed, and interrelated. We think of maquila zones along the border. We think about that garment factory in Kingston, Jamaica. We think about favelas in Rio and their connection through international nonprofit foundations to musical channels for making, reaching audiences outside of Brazil. These patterns no longer seem quite so neatly settled into simple, discrete units we can draw lines around on a map. There is no alternative, a line attributed to Margaret Thatcher and sometimes shortened to Tina, has been the prevailing dominant position about globalization and global capitalism in the last 30 years. I'm afraid that means the entirety of your lives. This notion comes out of the conviction that communism has failed. The end of the Cold War signaled that definitively, that the market rules and should rule as the most efficient and best way to allocate resources. The state in this logic is seen as inefficient, incapable, and inept. Neoliberalism and neoclassical economics, structural adjustment, and globalization reigns. The market and its effects are naturalized, are treated as things beyond contestation, beyond our power to resist or refuse. However, people will always need use values, right? You don't eat your food because it contains a certain amount of exchange value, do you? You eat your food because it feeds you. It has use value. You may have to buy it, and what you can buy may depend on what you can sell and how much you get paid. But at the end of the day, it's use values that keep you alive, and people, when deprived of their use values or access to them, will defend their needs and values, interests, environments, health, etc. The struggle of that group of women on the border in Machiapolis is one illustration. The struggle of the coffee cooperative members in Ethiopia is another. We've seen instances of resistance throughout the semester. Deprivation, inequality, and degradation provoke these kinds of resistances. What people do, including the regions and the built environments they produce, have lasting and ramifying effects. Thank you. So, I'm afraid the last task is the evaluations, and I'm not allowed to be in the room while you do them. So we'll pass them out. If you can please get them back. Is there a student who would be willing to deliver the evaluations to Dolores Dillard in 507 McCone afterwards? You up for that? All right, you get the envelope.